Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. This is a conversation with Emily Withers. So I'm pleased to welcome her to the Stronger 2021 conference. Thanks for being here, Em.
Hello, lovely to see you.
And it is an honour to be interviewing Emily today. So Emily is, she's based in Brighton. She's the head of communications at St. Peter's Brighton. And as well as that, she also offers freelance communication consultancy services as well. So she's a very busy lady. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your day.
No worries.
I actually had the pleasure of working with Emily a few years back when we were both at HTB in London. So it's really exciting for me to be able to have a discussion with her today, ask her some questions. We're going to be talking about all things church comms, particularly how church comms has evolved and changed in the last 12 months, and learn a bit about Emily's experience through that at St. Peter's. We're also going to talk about generally social media and communication, and then about how kind of Christians should interact online with social media. So Emily, thank you again for being with us. And, you know, kick us off and tell us, how's the last 12 crazy months been for you?
Well, in a nutshell, I got engaged actually in the last 12 months.
Cool.
Actually currently looking at our third wedding date.
Wow.
So just rolling with that. Work-wise, I transitioned from being entirely freelance into being part-time freelance and part-time working for St. Peter's Church in Brighton down here. And I started that, it's actually just about 2 or 3 weeks before the whole nation went into lockdown.
Good timing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so your entire time at St. Brighton's has been literally in lockdown, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I met everyone. We were all in an office together, and then very quickly it was clear that everyone was going to have to start working from home. So comms just started from scratch again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was very much an events organisation. The building was a hive of activity, had a full calendar. We don't even know how we're going to do Sundays. We don't know how we're going to do courses. Like, what is it that we're going to start communicating? So it was it was an interesting challenge and opportunity just to come in at that time. I actually felt quite invigorated by it. I was like, right, got a complete blank slate. What are we going to do with this?
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting because, you know, our churches do often become kind of like event venues, don't they, where we kind of use it as a tool to serve not just Sundays, but we've got courses and events and different groups that meet. And I can't imagine that shift to suddenly being online overnight must have been, you know, a real shock to the system for any church, including kind of big churches like St. Peter's. So during that time, what do you feel that, you know, that the major challenges have been kind of in that shift? And do you think that impacts how the churches will communicate moving forwards as well past the pandemic?
That's a good question. I think it opened up the opportunity to start moving into, we're going to come to you wherever you are, rather than come to us. So suddenly we were able to go into people's living rooms with church online. We were able to offer courses. We were able to pack up hampers and deliver them to people's doorsteps who were those most vulnerable in Brighton. So I think there was a real opportunity there to kind of flip the script on the church comms. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think also just learning that control is a bit of an illusion. Like, to have agility is a real strength in communications or just generally in life. And if you're working for a church, there is a slight difference in wanting to be led by God's nudge and having that posture of receptivity to that through it all. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have a comms calendar and plan ahead and be effective and efficient. Mm-hmm. I think it's it's just recognizing that there can be creativity, innovation, and play like in the everyday. Otherwise, you can just find that you have a God in structure or a God in routine, rather than just how can we make the best positive impact in our local community today, and are we doing the best we can to partner with God through that?
Amazing. I love that. I think you said innovation, creativity, and play. I think those, are really key words that, are driving a lot of what we're seeing online, churches doing new things. I wonder do you have any examples of how potentially in the last 12 months that St. Peter's has experienced those things, or do you think that's something that you're still learning to do?
Well, I've learned an insane amount in the last 12 months, and the whole time it's been from that posture of being a learner and sort of reacting to the now, just because that's the only way that we could have. But I think one thing that stands out was looking at which posts performed the best across like the first few months of lockdown. And the top 6 posts on every single platform were those where we demonstrated a clear positive impact in our local communities. So we were highlighting what we were doing with the Love Your Neighbour campaign, which I think started at HTB Church in London. And we were just showing, here's some volunteers packing hampers every day, they're delivering them here. And I think as a church, it can be quite difficult to know how to navigate that kind of message when you're saying, you don't want to be like, look at us, or virtue signal how great we are doing this. But actually there's something in just shouting out to volunteers, or just not being afraid of showing that action can speak louder than words. And this is how the church is responding to the pandemic, just spoke volumes. And there was so much engagement, so many comments, and they were so far above and beyond like any other type of comms we're putting out there. And it just shows where people's heart is at.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting to hear, because obviously it sounds like people are responding to the stories of other people and the real life things that you're doing, which often we don't see on social media. You spoke about, just to note here, the engagements that you were noticing on posts. Obviously you're referring to social media platforms. Do you at St. Peter's use a combination of communication channels, or do you mainly use social? Can you just maybe give us an idea of what channels you're using for your comms?
Yeah, so we use Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and started TikTok. There's someone on the team who's quite young, so just kind of you can crack on with TikTok. I feel a bit too old for it. And just as we went into lockdown in March last year, we launched a newsletter, which had been something that I know St. Peter's had been keen to do for a while, but suddenly it was actually necessary. There was no physical notice sheet anymore, no natural point of contact each week, not at that stage anyway. So yeah, we launched St. Peter's Extra, and that's still, other than word of mouth, that's still the most effective form of marketing, is emails, like going directly into someone's inbox, catchy subject title, and we just try to make it quite light and dynamic, but also giving some dates for your diary and all of that stuff.
Love that, light but really practical. I think you're spot on there. I have had conversations in various spheres this week about email marketing, that people feel that social media is where it's at, but actually email marketing still has a real place in comms and kind of staying in contact with our flock and our community. So I love that you brought that up. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So with the church now being very much online, we're having Sunday services online, our connect groups are via Zoom, we're connecting with very much online. There is very limited face-to-face church happening.
Yeah.
My question for you, Emma, is if church is currently online, moving forwards, is there any need for a physical address for the church, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think I'd say, like, before the pandemic, I could easily have sat in the camp of church as a group of people. You don't need an address, you don't need a building, it's a community, it's a movement. But I just seen how beautiful and impactful it is to have a physical space that is versatile. So last year, for example, at St. Peter's, instead of it being that hive of activity where you'd have courses every single day of the week, everyone would be there on Sundays for various services, it suddenly became a warehouse overnight with just loads of volunteers in there packing hampers. It also became a place for private prayer and reflection. And Sundays, when we could open up the building, was for people who just really felt that deep longing for connection, or they felt particularly lonely. And just having a space that God can use in whatever way the community most needs, I find that really exciting. But it's maybe taking less of a focus, particularly just on Sundays, but actually what is this space and how much can it evolve and morph and change over time, and how is it impacting the community?
That's awesome. It brings to mind what you mentioned earlier about being agile with your comms, but actually it sounds that, you know, physical church can, you know, learn from this, that being agile with your space and your resources is also something that, you know, can help strengthen our communities moving forwards and offer new things and new support for people.
Yeah, massively.
That's great. I think, you know, some really awesome points there. I want to talk to you about communication, about you personally, because you are a fantastic you have fantastic use of words. You speak very eloquently, and you're very purposeful in how you speak. So I'd love to ask you a few questions about your kind of experience with your personal communication and anything that you can kind of advise us or help us with that. First off, like, you and I, we're a similar age. We grew up in the world where Facebook was new, the only social media platform, to kind of this explosion of new platforms and social media being hugely immersive for our age group. But in your experience, how do you feel social media has changed over the years, kind of from that first kind of inception of Facebook, if you will?
Oh, wow. It's changed so much. I feel like it's gone from a simple little baby to a complex adult, just how much it's evolved. I don't know if you remember back when Facebook first started, and I was obsessed with Facebook statuses, and it always said, like, you had to have an action. It was Emily is something. So obviously my degree wasn't enthralling enough. I was thinking about Facebook statuses all day. So Emily is what? And also I remember that you would engage really personally on people's walls. So I'd be like planning sleepovers with friends, like on their Facebook walls. And so it's gone from like quite a personal tool to a public one. And it's become a very strategic, influential and powerful over the course of, however, 13 years now. I think it's 2007 Facebook started. Apparently now people are on social media more than television. So it just shows how much people are giving their attention to it. And I think I've just seen a massive shift, having worked in comms for that time, just how much onus and how much onus they put on the comms department. So I've worked in organisations where you could just be siloed completely by yourself, doing the social media, not in any of the meetings, and just almost trying to create content from an empty source, to where I'm at today, where I think there's very few organisations in the world now that don't recognise the leverage of social media. And I've just got an ear in all of the important conversations, whether I need to contribute vocally or not. I'm there absorbing and listening to like the movement and the fluctuations of the organisation, and it helps to inform so much what we're putting out there. Like, how have you seen it change over years?
Even before Facebook, I think my first experience of some sort of social media, people may remember Bebo or even MySpace, kind of the predecessors to Facebook. I think it's interesting looking back to, obviously, being much younger, what I shared openly on Facebook at the time. You spoke about kind of planning people's sleepovers and things openly on a wall, which, you know, happened, and you were very open with your conversations, and it was much more about those conversations and a way to keep up with people on a daily basis, rather than now it's a little bit more showy. It's a little bit more, here's my highlight reel of my day, rather than you know a way to connect with people. Obviously you have siloed things like WhatsApp, which is also social media, and you have Facebook Messenger, where almost that conversation that used to happen on people's walls is now, you know, more private, which, you know, there's benefits to both, I think, to kind of having open communication with people, but also still having privacy in it. And obviously that's something that we're all still trying to navigate with social media. I really liked what you said, swinging back to what you said about comms having a place in the meetings in organizations. And I remember very early days when I was working in organizations about social media before Instagram, before you could do a story on Instagram, before you could, you know, tag a location on Instagram, very early days, kind of almost like headbutting my way into meetings, saying, no, I need to be in this meeting, not because I need to have something to say, but I want to help you communicate what you're trying to do on social media. Do you think that you know, people include comms in the right kind of conversations, or do you think organizations can do more to make sure that, you know, the right people are in the room?
Yeah, I'm sure it's very organization specific. I'm really heartened with St. Peter's approach, and I'm a bit surprised as well, because it's probably the first time I've experienced inclusion to this extent. And it's so helpful, like you said, just it's actually helping to communicate it so much more clearly and authentically right from the horse's mouth, so to speak, rather than it being Chinese whispers in the corridors and trying to extract the nugget that you want to hear. I've done a lot of like live talks straight onto Twitter. If someone was trying to tell me what that talk was, but I'm not sitting in the room live and hearing it and hearing the key messages to get out there, it's just one step too removed. It needs to be really central and right in the heart of every organisation, in my opinion.
Love that. And go back to your personal social media, we veered off there back into church and organisations, but you are, one thing that I love being a friend, following you on social media, is you're really intentional with how you use your social media in a way that is quite different to how other people I follow use it. Often, quite lately, you've used story functions to kind of ask people really interesting questions and to trigger conversation. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you do that and why you use social media in that way?
Well, that's definitely nice to hear, and I think I've got to quite a natural place with it, which can just take time when you're trying to figure out what your relationship with social media is. Yeah, it reminds me of a quote Elizabeth Day said from her book How to Fail. She said, "Success only feels good when it's congruent with who you are." And for me, whatever I put out there on social media, I really want it to come from a place of integrity and like wholeness in my life. So integrity comes from the Latin that means whole. That's why integer in maths is a whole number. But it's just like social media shouldn't be like a separate part of your life, but actually a place of overflow. So when I share book recommendations or like my cooking recipes or the questions that you said that I sometimes pose on Insta stories, that's coming from what I'm like pouring into my life and naturally thinking about and just can't not share, rather than almost having, I know I work in comms, but I'm slightly allergic to the words like comms strategy. I've been asked, like, what's your comms strategy for your, like, oh, I can't, maybe it just reminds me too much of work. And actually, to be really authentic, it's just coming from that overspill or that overflow of my life.
Do you think it's really obvious, or do you think you're able to tell when social media is too engineered? Do you think that's obvious as well?
I can tell within myself. So like if I post something that I just know isn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't feel like it's quite true to me, I'll immediately get that feeling after I've posted it and delete it. But I'm getting better at intuiting that beforehand, so I don't post it in the first place. Yeah, it's interesting. Like reading other people's authenticity is quite a difficult thing to do, because you can only know someone partly. You can never know someone as their whole entity, and everyone's perception of every individual on planet Earth is different, even, and which I actually find quite freeing. Like it's very easy to be misperceived or misjudged, because no one knows what's going on in your head, your heart, your soul, all of those things. So, and it's quite easy to judge. So I can look at people's social media and maybe think it sniffs a little bit of inauthenticity. But actually, if I'm walking really closely with that person and actually know how their day was, and actually hear it from them and what is going on, then it often matches up much more truly to reality. So I think it is actually about being proximate to those people that you're prone to judge.
Yeah, definitely. I think, having real relationships with people that we also have relationships with on social is a great way to kind of figure out who's being authentic and who's not. It's an interesting discussion, an interesting thing to consider when we're swiping through people that we follow, that, what feels authentic and what do we know is authentic. On that note, do you feel that people take what they put on social media too seriously? Do you think people spend too much time agonizing over what words to use or what they should post?
Yeah, I'm sure all of us do it at certain times. It's an interesting thought. It reminds me of a quote from Elizabeth Gilbert. I literally only quote Elizabeth's. It was in her book Big Magic, where she's talking about creativity in your craft, and she says, take things seriously, but hold them lightly. So when I actually think about people taking things seriously on social media, I can think that can actually be a really beautiful thing. Like someone trying to frame beauty in the world and place it on social media, or being generous with their vulnerability, or putting profound words out there. But it's where your worth is wrapped up. So if your worth is wrapped up in what you put out there, then you are taking it too seriously, and you're taking yourself too seriously, because ego's in the mix. So I just find that phrase, I often repeat it to myself, like, am I taking this seriously and pouring my creativity and playfulness and ingenuity into it, but also holding it lightly the moment you post it? Mm-hmm. It doesn't have a massive impact on your ego or your worth or your identity. It's out there for the world to do with what it wants.
Love that. Love your quotes from Elizabeth.
Yeah, I don't know if I got any more.
Do you think that as Christians we should be more serious with what we post, or do you think that we potentially should just kind of go with the flow and post what we feel is more authentic?
Yeah, I think authenticity and humility are really key. I think for not a lot of people, it's quite a small breed now, but for some people, being authentic is not being on social media at all.
Yeah.
I think it reminds me of the overflow thing. I think it's a verse in Luke. It's out of the overflow of your heart, the mouth speaks. So this is just my own personal opinion, but I would spend more time thinking, what are you pouring into your life outside of social media? What are you spending your time doing there? And then that naturally informs what your mouth speaks. Like, what is your heart just brimming with so much that the overflow is what pours out onto social media? And as a Christian, people will be fairly intentional about what it is that they're pouring in and putting out there. But I think it's completely down to every individual knowing that for themselves, and feeling true to themselves with that. I don't think there should be hard and fast rules. Social media is still a little baby.
Yeah, that's crazy to think that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, social hasn't been around for very, very long. I mean, you and I were here for the inception of it, and there are people who are part of this conference who, Gen Z, who have never experienced life without it. But there's a whole world of people who, you know, had their whole lives plus, you know, years and years without social media. It's strange to think of the world before social media, even though there was one that existed.
Yeah, it's absolutely mental.
So imagine this. I have a question for you. Imagine if Instagram overnight was deleted. It was wiped. Everything is gone. Your posts, your connections, your messages, everything. How do you think that would impact you?
Well, instantly I felt a bit of relief, which I think is quite telling. I just thought, I pictured myself on a mountainside in a shepherd's hut surrounded by books, which I could do anyway. Instagram's not chaining me to the ground. I am unfettered. But what I'd miss is like that spark of unexpected connection. Mm-hmm. So whether it's someone puts a quote out there or a thought that just crystallizes my experience and it's really profound for me, or someone just DMs me and says, oh, I bought that book you recommended last month for my mum and she loved it. Or actually, I was in Porto, definitely not last year, the year before, and Insta storied about it. And my friend messaged and said, I'm in Porto as well. And then we just hooked up and had an amazing chat with an Aperol Spritz. And it's like those unexpected sparks and moments. And particularly in the last 12 months, I've seen how like movements can rise up, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, and just seeing how like collective voices can come together. And I've been really educated through social media in a way that I can't really see that I was as significantly before last year. So I'm just really interested to see where it goes. So I think I'd be more disappointed than I would be relieved and like run off to the mountainside. But yeah, Instagram is just an example of where you can find all of those things. If that was deleted, we're adaptable, we create new things like that. We have a creator God and we're creative ourselves. We'll just come up with new ways to do similar things that we need to do. So I'm not really that concerned about Instagram itself.
Yeah, I love that. I think from what you're saying, what I hear is that Instagram, love it or hate it, is a tool for connection, and it's a tool to stay in touch and on the heartbeat of what your community's doing, what the world's doing. But ultimately, it's all about connection, isn't it? It's all about being able to passively or actively communicate with people that you know, but also, you know, connect with people that, you know, you never would have had the opportunity to connect with before, or to speak to, or to learn from. I think, like you said, if Instagram died tomorrow, we would figure out a new way to connect with people in that way. I think that's
yeah, definitely.
So as we kind of come to the end of like the questions that we have for you, my last question is, before we go to kind of any Q&A that anyone watching has, any questions, my last question is for someone who might be listening today and they're working in a digital comm space within a church or a charity or within a Christian organisation, or within any organisation, to be fair. Are there anything, you know, in the last year, or any resources that you found have been really instrumental or helpful to you in the last 12 months?
I think the thing that springs to mind is the book Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, which I hadn't heard of his name before the last 12 months. And he just really helps you flip the script on the user or your audience being the hero of the story, and you as the organization are the guide, and you take them from A to B. And through the book, which is really, really practical, you can build a new website, you can establish a master brand strategy, and from that, establish how you communicate on every channel within every ministry or department. It's a helpful lens through which to think, how am I communicating to people and why, and which roles are we playing for each other? So I'd really recommend that as Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. He does webinars as well, which you can sign up to for an hour, and they're all really helpful.
Okay, fab. That sounds awesome. I think putting the audience in the driving seat and you seeing them, that's really powerful, isn't it? We often make the story about us when actually it's about our audience or our community's experience, that we're just kind of playing a facilitator role of. I love that.
Yeah.
So if there's anyone who has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will get round to asking those. Emily, it's been really fascinating talking about your journey through the last 12 months at St. Peter's as well. I wonder if you had any thoughts around what maybe the first few months outside of lockdown might be for comms in the church.
Well, we're starting those conversations now internally, which is they're just really interesting. And nothing has particularly landed from them, but so many churches across the UK didn't have online services, or we didn't, and didn't have a newsletter, and so many different things. So we're now asking the questions, do we carry on? Do we change because this worked for the pandemic, but actually it doesn't work long term for such and such a reasons? How do physical services and online services interrelate? All sorts of questions that you do need to create some headspace and facilitate discussions around and have the right voices in the room. And again, not be afraid of getting it wrong. Like we're going to be figuring it all out, and you just need to make a short-term plan and keep reviewing it. That's what the last year has really taught me. It's just like constantly adopting the role of the learner and reviewing and then figuring it out as you go. I definitely don't have any clear answers, but even within those discussions I've been part of, there's lots of different opinions and thoughts, and they all seem really valid. So it just shows there's multiple options and there's not one way of doing things. So it'll be interesting to see.
I love that, adopting the role of the learner, not being afraid to try, but also that there's not anything intrinsically wrong. There's no wrong move as such. But one question here saying, what are the top churches to watch or copy in terms of church comms? Who do you think we should be watching? St. Peter's, obviously.
St. Peter's. Well, I read that and thought, I actually have become very embroiled, is probably the wrong word, but I'm so in the detail of everything we're putting out for St. Peter's and watching that each weekend that I don't spend my weekends watching like multiple church services. So I think I can only say with integrity, St. Peter's. Oh, and my parents' church in Brackley. They're putting out some lovely stuff. Yeah. What about you? Is there any that you would say, oh yeah, watch those guys?
Like you, I guess I have to have favouritism to my own church. I'm at C3 in Cambridge. I enjoy what they do. They're really diligent about what they put out on live and ensuring that there's lots of variety for people, I think. And talking, you spoke earlier about community and the most engagement that's come from the community stuff. I think churches actively living out community and sharing that journey on social, I think that's really powerful. And C3 in Cambridge are really, really good at doing that. Another question here, what is a sensible approach to balance frequency and interesting content of posts from a comms perspective? So I think, how much should people be posting and what kind of different kind of content, pieces of content or versions of content do you think people should be sharing?
That's a good question. It really differs from organisation to organisation, but I think it does stem from being in the right meetings. So, and also having an in or a direct line to whoever the vision holder of your organisation is, so they can very clearly establish these are the priorities for now. So you can have maybe your pillars, like these are the main 3 things we're going to communicate for this term. So in terms of frequency, you'd know that those had more of a concerted push, and then everything else can kind of flow and weave in between those. I think in terms of interesting, again, it comes from being like playful and being up for being creative and just trying stuff. And the data doesn't lie. So if you put out a funny video but no one laughs, then it might have just been funny in your own head. But I just think there's no harm in playing and learning from the data. And that just comes from being down on the ground and just inspiration and instinct.
Big fan. I'm a big fan of knowing the data and paying attention to that, because I think it's often important to remember data is really important and numbers are really important, but data is essentially human behaviour, and it's our way of kind of quantifying human behaviour. So it's
definitely
important to remember. I'm going to paraphrase your question, Neil, so forgive me if I get this wrong. The question is about having a physical church audience and an online church audience when it comes to worship and the experience of kind of sung worship. I'm going to interpret this as that, is live streaming worship from a church service online, is that going to be the right move, or do you think those 2 audiences need a different experience of sung worship?
It's a great question, and these are the kind of things we're starting to talk about at the moment. So I haven't got a fully formulated thought in my mind, but it is different. Like your experience at home watching church on YouTube compared to being in church physically surrounded by people is a really different experience, and it's important to be aware of that. I think one thing that we're exploring moving forwards is how symbiotic are those 2 things? So the physical service and the digital, are they in competition with each other, like completely tailored to different audiences, and you're building a digital congregation alongside a physical one, or are they acting as a bridge for one another? And therefore, would you want your digital church to look and feel fairly similar and give quite a clear view as to what you'd expect if you walked through the building into church, because that's the ultimate aim? Are you trying to get people off their sofas into church? So I think it's probably figuring out if you want those 2 things to be separate, and if there's value in building a digital congregation as well as a physical one, or if ultimately you want it all to be physical, local, face to face. And that's really down to church leadership and figuring out what works best for each church.
Yeah, I think that navigating that transition to online and offline, and do we want the offline people to come online, or vice versa? That's some stuff that the church is going to have to navigate moving forwards. But for the time being, and the future, the foreseeable future, there is going to be a hybrid of the 2. And Neil's just clarified here that his question was around not just sung worship, sorry Neil, but around kind of sermons and liturgy and digital.
Yeah.
Do you feel that maybe, should the in-person service be hearing the same sermon as the online church, or is that important that they're all in synergy together? Or do you think because there's quite potentially different audiences that would need to be tailored?
I think, again, it's looking at the data. So if, say, you're putting it out on YouTube and you see that your audience is not local, and you are preaching every Sunday to lots of people in Cambodia, that will affect what you're saying. if that's the audience that you're attempting to reach. But if it is predominantly local, so for us in Brighton, our YouTube audience is pretty much all local and surrounding areas with a few extra people as well. So the message can be the same, but it's not just who your audience is, but it's like, who do you want your audience to be? So again, it's the whole, like, what's your vision and mission as a church? Is it local, or is it for the nation or for the world? So if you are just speaking to Cambodians, but you want to be speaking to Brightonians, then it's probably just keeping the message on track, but actually looking at how you target your video to attract the right audience. I don't know if that answered it right, but yeah.
Love that. It's being clear about who your audience is and who you're serving, and as well as looking at the data to make sure that is all lined up, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been lovely to chat to you today. Thank you so much for imparting your wisdom and your experience with us about the last 12 months and your experience personally, as well as at St. Peter's. If people want to get in contact with you, if they had any further questions, what's the best way that they could do that?
They could email me, emily.withers@mac.com. You can follow me on social media. I'm ESWithers on Instagram. That's probably the best place. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. And I'm sure we will be seeing more of you in times to come. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.